Good afternoon. Today I wanted to do a reading about the Traitor. As I've been thinking about Seven Pillars of Wisdom myself over the last few weeks, I realized that these are very typical situations that one runs into in trying to build a business of any kind, whether it be Bedouin tribes for battle or any other sort of business. Metaphorically, there's always a traitor. And so I decided to read the chapters that relate to the one traitor that Lawrence of Arabia experienced during his early career in World War I. And so today I'm reading from this version of Seven Pillars of Wisdom. That's what it looks like on the cover. I gave my other one to Tim Holmes, but anyway, so this particular passage that I'm going to read. Hi, Art. Nice to see you. Glad to see you're here. This particular chapter does two things. It introduces Ali, who was played by Omar Sharif in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. And it also introduces, is the first introduction of Abdullah al-Kadar, who was the traitor. And I had read a little piece about him a little later when he actually does his dirty deed, but I thought I should go back and read this since I found it again. So I won't be taking any, I may take some questions at the end. It's a very short chapter, but I just want to read it. Chapter 70, page 287 of this particular version of Seven Pillars of Wisdom. However, the Arab movement lived on Allenby's good pleasure, so it was needful to undertake some operations, less than a general revolt in the enemy rear, an operation which could be achieved by a raiding party without involving the settled peoples, and yet one which would please him by being of material help to the British pursuit of the enemy. These conditions and qualifications pointed upon consideration to an attempted cutting of one of the great bridges in the Yarmouk Valley. It was by the narrow and precipitous gorge of the river Yarmouk that the railway from Palestine climbed to Haran on its way to Damascus. The depth of the Jordan Depression and the abruptness of the Eastern Plateau face made this section of the line most difficult to build. The engineers had to lay it in the very course of the winding river valley. To gain its development, the line had to cross and recross the stream continually by a series of bridges, the farthest west and the farthest east of which were the hardest to replace. To cut either of these bridges would isolate the Turkish army in Palestine for one fortnight from its base in Damascus and destroy its power of escaping from Allenby's advance. To reach the Yarmouk, we should need to ride from Aqaba by way of Azraq, some 420 miles. The Turks thought the danger from us so remote that they guarded the bridges insufficiently. Accordingly, we suggested the scheme to Allenby, who asked that it be done on November the 5th or on the 3 following days. If it succeeded, the weather held up afterwards for a fortnight. The odds were that the coherent unit of von Ress's army would survive to retreat to Damascus. The Arabs would then have their opportunity to carry their wave forward into the great capital, taking up at the halfway point from the British, whose original impulse would then be nearly exhausted and the exhaustion of their transport. For such an eventuality, we needed at Azraq an authority to lead the potential local adherents. Nasser, our usual pioneer, was absent, but out with the Beni Sakr was Ali ibn al-Hussein, the youthful and attractive Harith Sharif, who had distinguished himself in Faisal's early desperate days around Medina, and later had out-Nukum's Nukum about al-Ula. Ali, having been Jamal's guest in Damascus, had learned something of Syria, so I begged a loan of him from Faisal. His courage, his resource, his energy were proven. There had never been any adventure since our beginning too dangerous for Ali to attempt, nor a disaster too deep for him to face with his high yell of a laugh. He was physically splendid, not tall nor heavy, but so strong that he could kneel down, resting his forearms palm up on the ground, and rise to his feet with a man on each hand. In addition, Ali could outstrip a trotting camel on his bare feet, keep his speed over half a mile, and then leap into the saddle. He was impertinent, headstrong, conceited, as reckless in word as in deed, impressive if he pleased on public occasions, and fairly educated for a person whose native ambition was to excel the nomads of the desert in war and sport. Ali would bring us the Beni Sakr. We had good hopes of the Sarahim, the tribe at Azraq. I was in touch with the Beni Hassan. The Ruwala, of course, and these are all names of tribes that he's pulling together for this operation. The Ruwala, of course, at this season were away in their winter quarters, so that our greater card in the Quran could not be played. Faiz el-Hussein had gone into the Leja to prepare for action against the Haran Railway if the signal came. Explosives were stored in desirable places. Our friends in Damascus were warned, and Ali Riza Pasha Rikabi, the city's military governor for the innocent Turks, and at the same time, the chief agent and conspirator with Sharif, took quiet steps to retain control if the emergency arose. My detailed plan was to rush from Azraq under guidance of Rafa, that most gallant sheikh who had convoyed me in June, and Qais in one of two huge marches with a handful of perhaps 50 men. Qais was Gadara, very precious with its memories of Menopause and of Meleager, the immortal Greek Syrian whose self-expression marked the highest point of Syrian letters. It stood just over the westernmost of the Yarmouk bridges, a steel masterpiece whose destruction would fairly enroll me in the Gadarene school. Only half a dozen sentries were stationed actually on the girders and abutments. Reliefs for them were supplied from a garrison of 60 in the station buildings of Hem, where the hot springs of Gadara yet gushed out of the advantage of local sick. My hope was to persuade some of the Abu Tayyid under Zal to come with me. These men wolves who make certain the actual storming of the bridge. I'm sorry, I need to read that with different emphasis. These men wolves would make certain the actual storming of the bridge. To prevent enemy reinforcements coming up, we would sweep the approaches with machine guns handled by Captain Bray's Indian volunteers from the cavalry division in France under Jamadir Hassan Shah, a firm and experienced man. They had been months up country, rail cutting from Wedge, and might fairly be assumed to have become experts on camelback, fit for the forced marches in prospect. The demolition of great underslung girders with limited weights of explosives was a precise operation, and demanded a necklace of blasting gelatin fired electronically. The Humber made us canvas straps and buckles to simplify the fixing. Nonetheless, the job remained a difficult one to do under fire. For fear of a casualty, Wood, the base engineer at Aqaba, the only sapper available, was invited to come along and double me. He immediately agreed, though knowing he had been condemned medically for active service as a result of a bullet through the head in France. George Lloyd, who was spending the last few days in Aqaba before going to Versailles on a regretted inter-allied commission, said that he would ride up with us to Jafar, as he was one of the best fellows and least obtrusive travelers alive. His coming added greatly to our forlorn anticipation. We were making our last preparations when an unexpected ally arrived in Abdullah al Kadar of Jazeera, grandson of the chivalrous defender of Algiers against the French. The exiled family had lived in Damascus for a generation. One of them, Omar, had been hanged by Jamal for treason, disclosed in the Pico papers. The others had been deported, and Abdullah al-Kadar told us a long story of his escape from Brusa and his journey with 1,000 adventures across Anatolia to Damascus. In reality, he had been enlarged by the Turks upon request of the Khedive Abbas Hilmi and sent down by him on private business to Mecca. He went there, saw King Hussein, and came back with a crimson banner and noble gifts, his crazy mind half persuaded of our right and glowing jerkily with excitement. To Faisal, he offered the bodies and souls of his villagers, sturdy, hard-smiting Algerian exiles living compactly along the north bank of the Yarmouk. We seized at the chance this would give us to control for a little time the middle section of the Valley Railway, including 2 of the 3 main bridges, without the disability of raising the countryside. Since the Algerians were hated strangers and the Arab peasantry would not join them, accordingly, we put off calling Rafa to meet us at Azraq and said not a word to Zal, concentrating our thoughts instead on Wadi Khalid and its bridges. While we were in this train of mind, arrived a telegram from Colonel Bramon, warning us that Abdullah al-Kadar was a spy in the pay of the Turks. It was disconcerting. We watched him narrowly, but found no proof of the charge, which was not to be accepted blindly, as from Bermond, who was more a liability than a colleague. His military temper might have carried away his judgment when he heard Abdel al-Qadar's outspoken public and private denunciations of France. The French conception of their country was a fair woman, lent to them in national spitefulness against those who scorned her charms. I'll read that again. The French conception of their country as a fair woman lent to them a national spitefulness against those who scorned her charms. Faisal told Abdel al-Kadar to ride with Ali and myself, and said to me, I know he is mad. I think he is honest. Guard your heads and use him. We carried on, showing him our complete confidence on the principle that a crook would not credit our honesty, and that an honest man was made a crook soonest by suspicion. As a matter of fact, he was an Islamic fanatic, half insane with religious enthusiasm and a most violent belief in himself. His Muslim susceptibilities were outraged by my undisguised Christianity. His pride was hurt by our companionship, for the tribes greeted Ali as greater and treated me as better than himself. His bullet-headed stupidity broke down Ali's self-control twice or thrice. His bullet-headed stupidity broke down Ali's self-control twice or thrice into painful scenes, while his final effort was to leave us in the lurch at a desperate moment, after hindering our march and upsetting ourselves and our plans as far as he could. Okay, that's the chapter I wanted to read. So I will chalk that one off. So that was the introduction of this fellow. And a few days ago, I read the next chapter that mentions him, which is 11 chapters later. But he, in that chapter, he rides off to warn the Turks that Lawrence and the others are coming to blow up the bridge. And so that the plot thickens because things then happen differently than expected. And let's see, mark here, beware. Okay. I'll leave that little note for the next time. But the next time we introduce Abdullah al-Kadar, he's actually going into Damascus at the same time, basically, that Lawrence is going into Damascus. And it's a very interesting exchange what happens next. So, as I said, in many large organizations that we find traitors, and hopefully not so many. But here I'm looking at the metaphors for anyone's life, and that's one thing to be careful of. And so my purpose in reading these particular chapters is to make you aware of what Lawrence was engaging in World War I. So thank you for joining me today. I'm going to terminate for today, and I will go on with this particular part of the story maybe tomorrow. Thank you for being here.